The pages of Scripture hold stories that make even the darkest crime documentaries pale in comparison. While we often hear about Cain's jealous rage or David's calculated betrayal, there are killers in the Bible whose methods were so twisted, so calculated and so shocking that they're rarely discussed from the pulpit. These aren't your typical Sunday school villains. These are predators who used cunning, manipulation, and pure evil to destroy lives in ways that still send chills down your spine. Today, we're about to meet 5 murderers whose stories reveal the darkest corners of human nature. From a woman who drove a tent peg through a man's skull while he slept, to a king who fed children to their own parents. These accounts will challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical violence. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Each of these killers believed they were justified in their actions. Are you ready to face the brutal truth about humanity's capacity for evil? Let's meet the 5 sickest murderers the Bible records, whose stories still haunt the pages of Scripture thousands of years later. Number 1, the tent peg killer. In the book of Judges, we encounter one of the most chilling murder scenes in all of Scripture. Her name was Jael, and she would become known as one of the most cunning killers in biblical history. What makes her story so disturbing isn't just the method she chose. It's the cold calculation behind every move she made. The scene unfolds during a time when Israel was oppressed by Jabin, king of Canaan, whose military commander Sisera had terrorized God's people for 20 years with 900 iron chariots. When the prophetess Deborah finally called Israel to war, something unprecedented happened. Sisera's mighty army was completely routed, and the feared commander found himself fleeing for his life on foot. Picture this moment: the most powerful military leader in the region, a man who had struck fear into entire nations, now running desperately through the wilderness. Exhausted, dehydrated, and completely vulnerable. And that's when he made the fatal mistake of trusting the wrong person. Sisera stumbled toward the tent of Heber the Kenite, whose family had peaceful relations with King Jabin. When Jael, Heber's wife, saw the desperate fugitive approaching, she didn't hesitate. With a voice sweet as honey, she called out to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not fear." But this wasn't mercy. It was the first move in a carefully orchestrated execution. Jael invited Sisera into her tent, the very place where ancient customs demanded absolute protection for guests. She covered him with a rug, gave him milk when he asked for water, and promised to stand guard while he slept. Every gesture was perfect, every word calculated to build trust. Sisera, exhausted from battle and flight, finally allowed himself to rest. What happened next reveals the true depth of Jael's planning. She waited. She watched. She listened until Sisera's breathing became deep and regular, until she was certain he was in the deepest possible sleep. Then, moving with the silence of a predator, she picked up a tent peg. A sharp, iron spike used to secure the heavy goat hair tents of that era. The Bible records the scene with chilling precision. Jael took a tent peg and picked up a hammer. She crept quietly to him and drove the peg through his temple and down into the ground. He was sound asleep and exhausted, so he died. Think about the physical reality of what she did. A tent peg wasn't a small nail. It was a thick, pointed iron stake several inches long. To drive it completely through a man's skull and into the ground beneath required multiple hammer blows. This wasn't a quick, merciful death. Sisera likely woke up during the first strike, experiencing unimaginable terror and agony before the final blow ended his life. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what Jael did next. When Barak, the Israelite commander, arrived searching for Sisera, she calmly walked out to meet him and said, "Come, I will show you the man you are looking for." She led him to her tent, where Sisera's body lay pinned to the ground, and she displayed her handiwork without a trace of remorse. The prophetess Deborah later celebrated Jael's action in song, calling her most blessed of women, and describing the murder in graphic detail. She put her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet he sank, he fell, he lay still. Between her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. What makes Jael's story so unsettling isn't just the brutality of the murder, but the premeditation behind it. Every kindness she showed was calculated. Every comfort she offered was part of the trap. She violated the most sacred laws of hospitality, turning her tent into a torture chamber and herself into an executioner. Some might argue that Jael was justified, that she was helping to free Israel from oppression. But the cold, methodical way she planned and executed the murder reveals something darker about human nature. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment killing or even a clean assassination. This was deliberate, personal, and brutal. Jael represents something terrifying about the human capacity for evil, the ability to smile while planning murder, to show kindness as a weapon, and to kill without conscience. Her story stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear as saviors. Number 2, the Butcher King. If you think modern warfare is brutal, wait until you hear about King Menahem of Israel, whose methods of violence were so extreme they defy comprehension. This wasn't just a king who killed his enemies. This was a man who turned cruelty into an art form, using terror as his primary tool of governance. Menahem's rise to power in 752 BC was built on blood from the very beginning. When King Shallum assassinated King Zechariah, Menahem saw his opportunity. But instead of simply killing Shallum and claiming the throne, Menahem chose to send a message that would echo throughout the kingdom for generations. The Bible records his actions with shocking brevity. Then Menahem struck Tifsah and all who were in it and its territory from Tirzah on, because they did not surrender to him. Therefore he struck it, and he ripped open all the women who were with child. Let that sink in. Menahem didn't just conquer the city of Tifsah, he turned it into a scene of unimaginable horror. When the city refused to surrender immediately, he unleashed a campaign of violence so savage that it defied every law of warfare known at that time. The phrase, "ripped open all the women who were with child," describes one of the most heinous war crimes imaginable. Menahem's soldiers, acting on his direct orders, systematically hunted down every pregnant woman in the city and performed crude, brutal cesarean sections that killed both mother and child. This wasn't collateral damage in the heat of battle. This was deliberate, calculated terrorism designed to break the spirit of anyone who might dare resist him. But what makes this even more disturbing is the systematic nature of Menahem's violence. The text says, all the women who were with child, meaning his soldiers went house by house, family by family, searching for pregnant women to torture and kill. Can you imagine the screams echoing through the streets, the terror in the eyes of families as soldiers broke down their doors? The absolute helplessness of husbands and fathers forced to watch as their wives and unborn children were butchered. This wasn't just murder. It was psychological warfare at its most twisted. Menahem understood that killing a few soldiers might win a battle, but killing pregnant women would terrorize entire populations into submission. Every person who heard about Tifsah would know exactly what would happen if they resisted King Menahem. The Bible tells us that Menahem ruled Israel for 10 years, from 752 to 742 BC. During that decade, his reputation for extreme violence preceded him wherever he went. Cities surrendered without a fight, rather than face the fate of Tifsah. His very name became synonymous with terror. But perhaps most chilling of all is how casually the Bible records his other activities. After describing the massacre at Tifsah, the text simply states, "At that time Pul king of Assyria invaded the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to strengthen the kingdom under his control." Think about that. A man who had just ordered the systematic torture and murder of pregnant women was conducting normal diplomatic relations, paying tribute to foreign powers, managing his kingdom's finances. He compartmentalized his brutality, treating mass murder as just another tool of statecraft. Menahem represents a terrifying truth about human nature, that some people can commit the most unspeakable acts and then go about their daily business as if nothing happened. He didn't kill in a moment of passion or rage. He planned and executed campaigns of terror with the same cold calculation that other kings used to plan trade agreements. The archaeological record suggests that Menahem's methods were effective in the short term. His kingdom remained relatively stable during his reign, probably because everyone was too terrified to rebel. But this stability came at an unthinkable cost in human suffering. What makes Menahem's story even more disturbing is that he likely justified his actions as necessary for maintaining order. In his mind, the systematic murder of pregnant women wasn't evil, it was efficient. One act of extreme violence could prevent years of rebellion and warfare. This is the mindset of a true psychopath, someone who can calculate the cost of human suffering in purely practical terms and find it acceptable. Menahem didn't just kill people, he weaponized the most sacred aspects of human life, pregnancy, motherhood, the hope for the future, and turned them into instruments of terror. King Menahem's legacy stands as one of the darkest chapters in biblical history, a reminder that the capacity for evil in human hearts knows no bounds when power is combined with a complete absence of conscience. Number 3, the jealous brother. Family feuds can turn deadly, but what Abimelech did to his own brothers goes beyond sibling rivalry into the darkest territories of human evil. This is the story of a man who murdered 70 of his own family members in a single day, and the method he chose reveals a calculating mind that planned every detail of his massacre. Abimelech was the son of Gideon, the famous judge who had delivered Israel from the Midianites. But unlike his father, who refused the crown when offered it, Abimelech burned with ambition for power. The problem was, he had 70 brothers who stood between him and absolute control over his father's legacy. The Bible records his twisted solution in Judges. He went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, survived because he hid. The phrase, "on one stone," isn't just a casual detail. It reveals the horrific nature of what Abimelech planned. He didn't kill his brothers in separate incidents or even in the heat of battle. He gathered them all together and executed them one by one on a single stone altar, turning their deaths into a grotesque ritual sacrifice. Picture the scene: 70 men, all sons of the same father, forced to watch as their brothers were systematically murdered before their eyes. Each brother knowing that his turn was coming, hearing the screams of the dying, seeing the stone slick with family blood. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical violence. But what makes this even more chilling is the planning that went into it. You don't kill 70 people spontaneously. Abimelech had to. First, he convinced the people of Shechem to fund his coup, appealing to their tribal loyalties by reminding them that he was their kinsman through his mother. Second, he hired worthless and reckless men, essentially a gang of mercenaries who would follow orders without question. Third, he gathered his brothers together, probably under the pretense of a family meeting or religious ceremony. Fourth, he organized the execution site, choosing a stone that would serve as both altar and chopping block. The methodical nature of this massacre reveals Abimelech's true character. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was genocide, planned with military precision. Each step was calculated to maximize both his power and his brother's terror. The Bible gives us a glimpse into Abimelech's mindset through his appeal to the people of Shechem. Which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember, I am your flesh and blood. Notice how he frames the massacre as a practical solution to a political problem. In his twisted logic, killing 69 innocent men was preferable to sharing power. He didn't see his brothers as human beings with rights, hopes, and families of their own. He saw them as obstacles to be eliminated. The only survivor was Jotham, the youngest brother, who managed to hide during the massacre. When he later confronted the people of Shechem for supporting Abimelech, his words give us insight into the true horror of what happened. If you have acted honorably and in good faith when you made Abimelech king, and if you have been fair to Jerubbaal and his family, and if you have treated him as he deserves. Jotham's speech reveals that the people of Shechem knew exactly what they were supporting when they backed Abimelech. They weren't innocent bystanders. They were accomplices to mass murder. Funding and enabling a man they knew was capable of killing his own family. The psychological impact of Abimelech's crime extended far beyond the immediate victims. Imagine being a servant in Gideon's household, watching the son of your beloved master systematically murder his own brothers. Imagine being a citizen of Israel, realizing that the son of your deliverer had become a monster. The trauma rippled through entire communities. What makes Abimelech's story particularly disturbing is how it reveals the corrupting nature of unchecked ambition. This wasn't a man who started evil and got worse. This was someone who let his desire for power override every natural human instinct, including the most basic loyalty to family. Abimelech ruled for only 3 years before his violent reign ended appropriately in more violence. But during those 3 years, his kingdom was built on the foundation of his brother's blood. A constant reminder that he had achieved power through the most unnatural act imaginable, fratricide multiplied 70 times over. His story stands as a chilling warning about what happens when ambition is completely divorced from conscience, when the desire for power becomes so consuming that it can justify any act, no matter how evil. Number 4, the cannibal king. In the darkest pages of biblical history lies a story so disturbing that most scholars struggle to even discuss it in detail. During the siege of Samaria, as described in 2 Kings, we encounter an act of cannibalism so twisted it defies comprehension. And at its center is an unnamed king whose response to this horror reveals the depths of human depravity. The siege had lasted for months. The Aramean army had surrounded Samaria so completely that no food could enter the city. What started as rationing quickly became starvation, and starvation became something far worse. The Bible records that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver, and a small portion of dove droppings cost 5 shekels, prices that showed just how desperate people had become. But then something happened that crossed every line of human decency. 2 women made a pact that would haunt the pages of Scripture forever. The first woman approached the king with a story that still makes readers recoil in horror. This woman said to me, "Give up your son so we may eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son." So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, "Give up your son so we may eat him," but she had hidden him. Think about what this woman was describing. She wasn't talking about eating an animal or even consuming something that had died naturally. She was describing the deliberate murder and consumption of her own child. And she was angry because her partner in this unspeakable crime had backed out of their agreement. The psychological horror of this scene is almost impossible to process. This mother had looked at her own son, a child she had carried for 9 months, nursed as an infant, watched take his first steps, heard speak his first words, and decided to kill him for food. The act required planning, preparation, and a complete abandonment of every maternal instinct. But what makes this story even more disturbing is the other woman's response. She had watched her friend cook and eat a human child, had probably participated in the meal, and then, when it came time to honor her part of the bargain, she hid her own son. This suggests she understood exactly how evil their pact was, but only when it came to sacrificing her own child. Now here's where the story takes an even darker turn, and where we meet our unnamed murderer. When the king heard this woman's complaint, his reaction wasn't horror at the cannibalism or grief for the dead child. Instead, he flew into a rage, not at the women, but at the prophet Elisha. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if the head of Elisha son of Shaphat remains on his shoulders today. Let that sink in. A king heard about the murder and cannibalization of a child in his kingdom, and his response was to order the execution of God's prophet. In his twisted mind, the problem wasn't that people were eating their children. The problem was that God's representative hadn't prevented it. This reveals something truly disturbing about this unnamed king's psyche. He had become so morally corrupted that he could hear about infanticide and cannibalism without flinching. But he couldn't tolerate what he saw as God's failure to intervene. His moral compass was so completely broken that he reserved his outrage for the wrong target. The king's decision to blame Elisha and order his execution shows a man who had lost all sense of moral responsibility. As the ruler, he bore ultimate responsibility for the conditions that led to such desperation. A good king would have surrendered the city rather than allow his people to resort to cannibalism. A decent human being would have been horrified by what he heard. Instead, this king chose murder as his response to murder. Rather than addressing the crisis of leadership and moral bankruptcy that had led to such conditions, he decided to kill the one person who might have provided spiritual guidance and hope. What makes this even more chilling is the calculated nature of his response. He didn't just make an angry threat, he sent a messenger to carry out the execution of Elisha. This was premeditated murder, planned in response to hearing about an even worse crime. The unnamed king represents a particularly twisted form of evil. The person who becomes so comfortable with violence and moral compromise that they lose the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. When confronted with the ultimate horror of child cannibalism, he couldn't recognize it as evil because his own moral framework had been completely destroyed. This king had presided over conditions so desperate that mothers were eating their children, and his response was to commit more violence. He represents the kind of leader who creates the very conditions that breed the worst kinds of human behavior, then refuses to take responsibility for the consequences. The story of the cannibal king serves as a warning about what happens when leadership fails completely, when those in power become so morally bankrupt that they can witness the worst of human behavior and respond with nothing but more evil. In a kingdom where children were being murdered and eaten, the king's greatest concern was silencing the voice of God. That level of moral blindness represents a darkness that goes beyond simple cruelty into the territory of true evil. Number 5, the betrayer queen. The most terrifying killers are often those who murder not in moments of passion, but through careful planning and political calculation. Queen Athaliah of Judah represents this type of evil in its purest form. A woman who systematically murdered her own grandchildren to secure power, turning the royal palace into a charnel house. Athaliah was the daughter of the infamous King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and she inherited more than just their throne. She inherited their complete absence of conscience. When her son King Ahaziah was killed in Jehu's revolt, most grandmothers would have grieved and perhaps sought to protect the surviving children. Athaliah saw opportunity. The Bible records her response with chilling brevity. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. But the word destroy doesn't capture the full horror of what she did. The Hebrew text suggests systematic, methodical killing, not a single massacre, but a campaign of murder that took time, planning, and multiple participants. Athaliah didn't just kill the immediate heirs to the throne. She hunted down every member of the royal bloodline she could find. Think about what this means. These weren't strangers or political enemies. These were her own grandchildren, great-grandchildren, nephews and nieces. Children who had called her grandmother, who had played in the palace courtyards, who had trusted her completely. And she ordered every single one of them killed. The psychological profile of someone who could do this is truly disturbing. Athaliah had to. First, make the conscious decision that power was more important than family bonds. Second, identify every potential heir, including small children who pose no immediate threat. Third, organize a network of killers willing to murder innocent children. Fourth, oversee the executions to ensure none escaped. Fifth, maintain the facade of legitimate rule while sitting on a throne built from the corpses of her own family. What makes this even more chilling is the methodical way she went about it. This wasn't a single night of violence. It was a systematic purge that probably took weeks or months to complete. Every day, Athalia woke up and continued her campaign of familicide, checking names off lists, sending soldiers to find children who might be hiding, ensuring that no one with royal blood remained alive. The Bible gives us insight into her mindset through her actions after the murders. She didn't retire in guilt or hide from the consequences of what she'd done. Instead, she ruled over the land for 6 years. She held court, made political decisions, conducted religious ceremonies, and presented herself as the legitimate queen of Judah, all while knowing that her throne was built on the bones of murdered children. This reveals a level of psychological compartmentalization that borders on psychopathy. Athalia could order the murder of her own grandchildren in the morning and conduct normal royal business in the afternoon. She had divorced herself so completely from natural human emotion that she felt no guilt, no remorse, no horror at what she had done. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how she used religion to justify her actions. As the daughter of Jezebel, Athalia brought Baal worship into Judah, building temples and appointing priests. She didn't just kill for political power. She used her stolen throne to corrupt the spiritual life of the entire nation. Think about the servants and officials in the palace during her reign. They knew what she had done. They had seen the blood, heard the screams, witnessed the systematic murder of innocent children. Yet they continued to serve her, to bow before her, to carry out her commands. Her evil was so comprehensive that it corrupted everyone around her. The only reason Athalia's dynasty of death finally ended was because one child escaped her net. Jehosheba, the sister of King Ahaziah, managed to hide the infant Joash and his nurse in the temple for 6 years. When Joash was finally revealed and crowned as the rightful king, the people's response tells us everything we need to know about Athalia's reign. All the people of the land rejoiced and the city was calm. The city was calm because the source of its terror was finally gone. When Athalia was executed, she didn't die with dignity or remorse. Even facing death, she showed no recognition of the evil she had committed. Her last recorded words were accusations of treason against those who were deposing her. She literally died believing she was the victim. Queen Athalia represents perhaps the most chilling type of killer. The person who can murder children and then sleep peacefully, who can destroy families and rule without conscience, who can corrupt entire nations and never feel guilt. Her story stands as a warning about what happens when the basic human bonds of love and loyalty are completely severed in service of raw ambition. For 6 years, the people of Judah lived under the rule of a woman who had proven she would kill anyone, including her own family, to maintain power. Every parent wondered if their child might be next. Every official feared that a single wrong word might result in execution. The entire kingdom lived under the shadow of a woman who had demonstrated that no bond was sacred. No life was safe, and no act was too evil if it served her purposes. The dark truth about biblical violence. As we reach the end of our examination of these 5 brutal killers from Scripture, we're confronted with uncomfortable questions that go to the very heart of human nature. These weren't mythical monsters or fictional villains. These were real people who walked the earth, breathed the same air, and faced the same moral choices we face today. Yet they chose paths so dark that their names still send chills through anyone who truly understands their stories. What makes these biblical murderers so disturbing isn't just the brutality of their methods, but the calculated nature of their evil. Jael's tent-peg murder required careful planning and cold execution. Menahem's massacre of pregnant women was systematic terrorism designed to break entire populations. Abimelech's slaughter of his brothers was genocide planned with military precision. The unnamed king's response to cannibalism showed moral blindness so complete it defied comprehension. And Athaliah's murder of her own grandchildren revealed a capacity for evil that infected an entire kingdom. These stories force us to confront a reality that many prefer to ignore. The capacity for evil in human hearts knows no bounds. These weren't people who started as monsters. They were individuals who made choices, one after another, that led them down paths of increasing darkness, until they became capable of acts that shock us even thousands of years later. But perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: every one of these killers believed they were justified in their actions. Jael saw herself as a liberator. Menahem viewed his terrorism as efficient governance. Abimelech framed his fratricide as political necessity. The unnamed king blamed God's prophet for conditions he had created. Athaliah convinced herself she was the legitimate ruler of Judah. This is the most chilling aspect of human evil, its ability to disguise itself as righteousness, to convince the perpetrator that their actions are not only acceptable, but necessary. Each of these murderers had rationalized their behavior, built mental frameworks that allowed them to commit unspeakable acts while maintaining their self-image as reasonable people. The Bible doesn't hide these stories or soften their impact. Instead, it presents them with stark honesty, forcing us to see what humans are capable of when they abandon conscience and embrace evil. These accounts serve as warnings, not just about the historical figures they describe, but about the potential that exists within every human heart. When we read about Jael's calculated betrayal, we're forced to ask, how easily do we manipulate others to get what we want? When we encounter Menahem's systematic terrorism, we must consider, what would we be willing to do to maintain our position or power? Abimelech's family massacre challenges us. How far would we go to eliminate competition or obstacles? The unnamed king's moral blindness demands reflection. When have we blamed others for problems we created? And Athaliah's dynasty of death forces the ultimate question: what bonds would we be willing to break to achieve our goals? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary ones. The Bible presents these stories not to glorify violence, but to show us the ultimate consequences of choices made without moral restraint. Each of these killers started with a single compromise, a moment when they chose personal gain over moral principle. That choice led to another and another, until they found themselves capable of acts they might once have found unthinkable. Yet even in these darkest stories, we find glimmers of hope. Jotham survived Abimelech's massacre and lived to speak truth. The prophet Elisha continued his ministry despite the unnamed king's threats. Young Joash was preserved through Athaliah's purge and restored to the throne. Even in the midst of humanity's worst behavior, God's purposes were not thwarted. These stories remind us that evil, no matter how powerful it appears, is ultimately temporary. Each of these brutal killers met their end, some through violence, others through the natural consequences of their actions. Their reigns of terror lasted for years, but their ultimate defeat was certain. The 5 murderers we've examined represent the darkest possibilities of human nature, but they also serve a crucial purpose in Scripture. They show us what we could become if we abandon the moral constraints that separate civilization from chaos. They demonstrate that evil is not abstract or distant. It's a real possibility that exists within every human heart, waiting for the right circumstances and wrong choices to emerge. As we close this examination of biblical brutality, we're left with both warning and hope. The warning is clear. Any of us, given the right circumstances and wrong choices, could walk similar paths of darkness. The hope is equally clear. These stories exist not to discourage us, but to help us recognize the signs of moral compromise before it's too late. The Bible doesn't hide from humanity's capacity for evil. It confronts it head-on, showing us both what we could become and what we must guard against. In the end, these stories of brutal killers serve as mirrors, reflecting back our own potential for both good and evil, and challenging us to choose light over darkness, love over hate, and life over death. The choice, as it was for Jael, Menahem, Abimelech, the unnamed king, and Athaliah, remains ours to make.